However, they did see Susan.
Come here! What are we talking about? Huh? I'm too good. I'm too good, all right? I'm too good, brother. Man, seen this coming from a mile away, chat. That'll do, pig. What?
By most people's standards, Susan Monica's life had been pretty good. She had a small but very close group of friends.
Okay.
She had a great job working as an engineer, and she lived in one of the most exciting cities in the world, San Francisco, California. But
I gotta go to
Susan
San
was not
Francisco
happy.
one day, bro.
Moving to the big city was not so much a choice as it was a product of life and circumstance. Deep down, Susan had always been someone who preferred peace and quiet and being alone,
That's
things
me.
that were
Facts.
in rare supply in a big city like San Francisco. Many nights after work, Susan would come home to her apartment and she would sit there and dream about moving away from the city and living off the grid somewhere on a farm, raise her own food and be totally self-sufficient away from everybody else in the world.
Say El Susan.
And then one day in 1991, when Susan was 43,
That'll do, pig is a famous saying meaning good job. What? That'll do, pig is saying good. Yo, what is this, bro? What is
years
this?
old, she made that dream a reality. That year, she wound up purchasing a 20-acre farm located in a forest in a little town in Oregon called Weimar. However, this farm was really not a farm. There was nothing on it. There was no house
Devin,
for
you're
Susan to
done.
live in. There was no barn for her animals or tools. There was no running water, no electricity, no septic system. It was just pure Oregonian wilderness.
Okay.
But to Susan, it was perfect. The property kept her far away from other people, and she liked the idea of having to literally build her own farm. After all, she was an engineer by trade, so she actually knew how to build buildings efficiently and safely, and she was a big, strong, sturdy woman who was not afraid of manual labor. So, when Susan finally arrived in Weimar and made her way up the winding dirt road through the forest and arrived in
Susan does not look like a big city woman. I ain't gonna lie. So, you know what I'm saying? I definitely see, rocking chair, front patio, in her living.
in front of
what
her
I'm saying?
property and looked out at the vast, rugged landscape for the first time, she was filled with a rush of excitement. Even though there was nothing on her 20 acres, it already felt like home.
That's crazy.
Over the next several months, Susan would
20
transform
acres is
these
crazy.
20 acres into a neat little farm, complete with a big barn and a shack for her to live in, and a few animal pens for livestock.
Nah, that's
However,
crazy.
after the farm was built, Susan realized that building the farm was actually not the hard part. The hard part
Maintaining.
was maintaining the
Come
farm,
on now.
going out there every day and doing all of her chores, feeding all the animals and doing all the different projects she had in mind. It was exhausting. And so not long after the farm was complete, Susan realized that as much as she wanted to be totally alone out there, she had to set that aside and hire some help. And so Susan printed out all of these help wanted flyers and put them all over town in Weimar, and before long, people began making their way up to her property to inquire about the role.
Bro, I have dreads.
Most of
I don't
these
care what y'all
applicants
say,
were
bro.
people who struggled to find work elsewhere, either because they lived a sort of transient lifestyle, bouncing around from place to place so no one was ready to hire them long term, or because they had a criminal record and just straight up could not get a job. But Susan didn't care about either of those
W. Susan, put it on for the people, all right?
things. All she cared about was the people she hired would work hard and they would respect the peaceful, calm atmosphere she was fostering on her farm. Basically, do the work.
About to
and
put the
leave
city
me
on
alone.
her back.
And over the next 20 years, Susan would find dozens of people who were able to do just that. Most of them would work for Susan only for a short period of time. Others would stick around for a little bit longer, but eventually all of Susan's workers kind of rotated pretty quickly and moved on to other things. And when that happened, Susan would simply put up more help wanted flyers in town and hire more people.
some more people.
And in all the 20 years that Susan had been hiring these temporary workers at her farm, after they did move on and went somewhere else, Susan never heard about them again. However, that was about to change. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old by this point, was outside of her shack out on her driveway when she happened to look up and see a
Yo, Susan look like she coached football, bro. Little league football. She got an undefeated team. Quarterback is a running, passing quarterback.
car coming up her
Hey,
road.
man.
Now remember, she lives in the middle of nowhere. No one comes out to see her, so this is a very rare event.
Okay.
And so Susan is totally keyed in on this car. And this car, they pull into her driveway, and then out of the car popped 3 young people. It was 2 young men and 1 young woman.
Okay.
And before Susan could even ask them who they were or why they were here, they were
snatching
telling
her up?
They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who at one point had told them he was working on Susan's farm in exchange for a little cash, and also Susan was letting him park his camper on her property, and he
Okay.
was living in that camper. The kids said their father always checked in with them at least once every couple of months, but they had just gone this really long stretch without hearing from him, and since he didn't have a cell phone and no permanent address, they had no real way of getting in touch with him, and so they were out there looking for him to make sure he was okay. And so they asked Susan, "Do you remember our dad, Robert? And if so, do you know where he is?" Even though this whole situation was totally surprising for Susan because she almost never got visitors, so that alone was kind of jarring for her. But when she heard the kids say their dad's name, Robert Haney, she immediately knew who that was. Susan told them that she had hired their father the previous spring to help build a structure on her farm.
Previous spring?
And initially, Robert was really nice to have around the farm.
It's a
He
year
worked really
later.
hard, he kept to himself, he was quiet, and he had a dog that was really friendly and loving. But in August of the previous year, so 5 months...
Hold on. Never piss this woman off is the title of this video. Susie killed him, all right? Fed him to the pigs. That boy's done. He's finished. He's out of here. Look, that's my prediction right now, all right? My predictions be spot on most of the time, so let's see.
into Robert's employment on Susan's farm, Susan would tell them that their dad totally changed. He started drinking really heavily and not really working very much and spending a lot of the day just kind of ranting and raving outside of his camper about how he wanted to exact his revenge on someone. Susan would eventually find out that what Robert was talking about is apparently one of his kids had been assaulted, and he felt very guilty that he had not been there to protect his child.
Oh, no.
And so the way Robert was handling this guilt was by drinking and thinking about getting his revenge on the attacker.
Gotta let
while
that pain
Susan
go,
did
big fella.
understand why Robert felt the way he did and why he was kind of acting the way he was, it didn't change the fact that Robert's behavior had become very disruptive on her farm, and the one thing Susan really wanted was peace and quiet. And so she decided she would have to go confront Robert about his behavior and potentially fire him if he couldn't find a way to calm down.
Okay.
But before Susan ever had to do that, Robert one day just walked right up to her shack, he handed her an envelope filled with cash, and he asked Susan if she wouldn't mind looking after his dog for a while. And Susan was so taken aback by his complete change in behavior and this request that she just took the envelope and said, "Okay, I'll look
I'm taking
after
the
your
bread
dog."
too, no cap.
And then Robert nodded as thank you. He turned around and he walked away from her. And then a few moments later, Susan's standing there with the envelope in hand, watching as Robert is climbing into some white car that had just pulled up in front of the property. She didn't know who was in the car with him.
Oh, that
And
boy
then the
about to
car
go
turned
catch a
around
body.
and drove out of sight. Susan told the kids that that had happened back in September, so about 4 months ago, and since he left, she had not heard from him, despite the fact she still had his dog, and she told the kids that a lot of Robert's stuff was
still
still
in the camper?
his camper.
That's crazy.
Susan brought the kids over to the side of her property
Zooey
where
was
Robert's
good.
camper was, and when they went inside, sure enough, all their father's things were all over the place, but the one item that immediately stood out to them was their father's tool belt. They knew their father was a traveling handyman. That was how he made his living. And so it begged the question, why would he leave his tool belt here if he knew he was going to be gone for several months potentially?
True.
It didn't make any sense. After leaving Robert's camper, the kids thanked Susan and asked her to please be in touch if she learned anything else about their dad, and she said she would. And then the kids got back in their car and they began driving south towards the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. When they got there, they asked to file a missing person report for their dad. However, they learned very quickly that it was going to be very challenging to locate their dad because their dad lived this transient lifestyle with no cell phone, he had no permanent address, he had nothing that could really be traced. But the investigators agreed with Robert's children that their dad's absence was a big concern.
Alarming,
given
yeah,
the fact
3-4
that
months?
his
Come
last
on now.
interactions with Susan had consisted of him drinking very heavily and talking about going and getting his revenge on his child's attacker.
Exactly.
And so the sheriff and the deputies were very concerned that that was exactly what Robert had done. He had gone out and potentially
The
murdered
dog's still
someone
there, gotta be.
and now was in hiding. So they asked Robert's kids if they could think of absolutely anything that could possibly allow investigators to track down Robert.
Okay.
And at some point, one of the kids said, "Oh, what about my dad's EBT card?" EBT cards, or electronic benefit transfer cards, are like debit cards for state welfare services. You can use the cards to buy things like groceries, and the cards are definitely traceable. A few days later, when Robert's EBT card trace came back, investigators saw the card had been used just 1 month earlier in a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm.
Okay, now when they say 30 minutes, Olivia, thank you for the sub, you know what I'm saying? When they say 30 minutes south of her farm, some of y'all are like 30 minutes to a Walmart? It couldn't have been Susan. That's probably what you're thinking. But if you have ever been to rural, you know what I'm saying, parts of America, you know the closest Walmart can be 30 minutes. Yeah, you're going to pass like $4-5 Dollar Generals on the way there, okay? But you go in a big box Walmart, though, okay? So it could have been Susan. Listen, Susan, you're not off the hook yet. You lied about the white car, all right? Don't play with me.
Now, this trace obviously didn't tell investigators where Robert was right now or what kind of condition Robert was in, but they had no other leads to operate on, so they decided they would go to the Walmart and see what they could find. When they got there, the investigators were led to the back room of the building where they were able to review the security footage from the previous month when Robert was supposedly there with his EBT card. But after reviewing hours and hours and hours of footage, the investigators never saw Robert on camera. However, they did see Susan.
Come here! What are we talking about? Huh? I'm too good. I'm too good, all right? I'm too good, brother. Man, seen this coming from a mile away, chat, all right? Seen it coming from a mile away, no cap, all right? You know what I'm saying?
On camera, and unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's EBT card. And so obviously this was very suspicious, and right away the investigators left the Walmart, went back to their office, and began the process of getting a search warrant to search Susan's farm.
Come on, what are we doing, man?
Last night, I decided I wanted to...
Yo, you know what I'm saying? Shout out to my mans, you know what I'm saying? I don't know what the sponsorship is. The Ridge wallet?
And his deputies arrived at Susan's property, and when they pulled onto her driveway, Susan came outside to greet them. When she asked them, what's going on, they told her, "Hey, we're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance." And before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said to her, "Hold on, just turn around, let's go back inside, I need to talk to you privately." And so Susan, who was very shocked by this, just said, "Okay," and she turned around and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies...
I'm pretty sure Susan walked up on my man, what's his name? Whatever his name is, my bad, I forgot his name. She walked up, she said, "Look, if you're going to stay here, you're going to have to give me some of that duh, all right?" And he was like, "Yeah, I got you." My man seen it, he was like, "You know what, Susan, I'm good, but I'm going to just, you know what I'm saying, do my part." You know what I'm saying? And she was like, "Oh, you're not going to give me none of that, you know what I'm saying?" And then she had to get him out of here, bro. That's the only logical answer, all right?
And out across the property to begin this big search. Once inside of Susan's house, they sat down in her kitchen, and right away the sheriff says to Susan, "Okay, I have you on camera using Robert's EBT card. I know you stole it, so you need to tell me where Robert is right now, or it's going to get a whole lot worse for you."
She fed him to the pigs, bro.
Susan's look of shock on her face quickly turned into a look of kind of relief. It was like suddenly she understood what was going on here. And she says to the sheriff, "No, I didn't steal his EBT card. He gave it to me along with an envelope full of cash when he left 4 months ago, and he told me to use it to buy dog food for his dog that I'm looking after." And since Robert had been gone for all these months, she had run out of cash to pay for the dog food and now was using the EBT card. Susan also added that if she had just stolen the card from Robert, she wouldn't be able to use it because it requires a PIN number. And Robert gave her the PIN number. That's how she...
Unless you use it for him one time, he gave you the PIN and now you know it forever. Come on now.
was able to
Who are
use
you
it.
lying to?
The
huh?
sheriff was not totally sold on Susan's story, and so he continued to ask more questions, trying to trip Susan up about how she came to acquire this card. But Susan was very firm that Robert had given her the card, and that was it.
Panda with
And
the
so after
ultra
several
band,
minutes,
you
the
know what I'm
sheriff
saying?
realized that Susan was likely telling the truth, which meant the EBT card angle was likely a dead end, and they would have to call off the search. But as the sheriff was standing up to leave the kitchen and leave the property
can you buy dog
altogether,
food with
a
EBT?
deputy from outside came running into the kitchen and without saying a word, just bent down and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. And as the sheriff is listening to this deputy, his face is contorting in disgust. He can't believe what he's being told. And after the deputy stands up and leaves the kitchen, the sheriff takes a deep breath and then looks at Susan and says, "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us."
Ooh,
Back at the station, a now
boy.
very flustered Susan was led into a small interrogation room where she sat down looking totally anxious. She's looking around, wondering what's going on. And then the sheriff walked into the room, immediately hit record on the camera, and then looked at Susan and says,
Bro,
"Has
she
anyone
looked like a
died
mob
on your
boss,
property?"
bro.
The story that Susan would tell the
She fed some... Man, listen. I watched Tiger King, all right? Shout out my guy Joe. You know what I'm saying? What was Carol Baskins? Yeah, y'all know about it. You know, it's a Carol. What happened to your husband, huh? Anyway, let's get back to this.
sheriff that day in the interrogation room was so completely unexpected and horrific, it would make headlines all across the country. Before Susan began this story, she told the sheriff that everything she had said about Robert Haney's disappearance had been the truth. However, she had left one little detail
What is
out.
that?
After Robert had handed Susan that envelope full of cash and the EBT card, and then climbed into that stranger's car and driven away, after that, Robert had actually come back to her farm, and recently. Susan said she discovered his return when one morning she got up and she went outside to go feed her animals when she looked over at the pig pen and saw all the pigs who would normally be laying down and lounging around at that time of the day. They were all up and they had converged in one portion of the pig pen, and they had kind of formed a circle around something on the ground, as if they were all trying to look at something on the ground. Now, Susan said this was totally uncharacteristic, so obviously something weird was going on, and so Susan dropped her food and rushed over to the fence. She climbed into the pig pen, and as she got closer and closer to all these pigs, she realized they weren't just looking at something.
They
on
were
the
eating
ground.
something.
They were eating something on the ground. And so Susan goes right up to this ring of pigs, and she begins pulling them aside, and then right in the middle on the ground is Robert. He was laying on his back.
Shut up. Shut up, Susan. Shut up. Shut up. Shut your mouth, all right? Ain't no way you didn't tell her kids this when they pulled up. Hey, I'm sorry about your dad. He came. First of all, you ain't report this to the police. You're lying. Second of all, his kids came, was like, yo, what happened to our dad? Oh, he left. You didn't mention he got eaten by your pigs. You're done, all right? Susan, you're done. Hey, look, go ahead. Here's these cuffs. Put them on. You're done. You're going to the electric chair, big fella.
And his
what are we
insides
doing?
had all been torn out. It was like the pigs were disemboweling him, and the most shocking thing is Robert was still alive. He was moving his arm and groaning. Susan tried to pull the pigs off of Robert, but she said they kept coming back and really aggressively continued to eat Robert. It was like they were in this feeding frenzy. And so Susan said, I thought about lifting him up and moving him, but Robert was practically split in two, and she felt like if she tried to move him, that would kill him anyways. And so Susan said she did the thing that she thought was right at the time. She left the pig pen, went into the barn, got a shotgun, ran back to the pig pen, raised the weapon, and fired it into Robert. Susan told the sheriff that this was purely an act of mercy. She was ending his suffering.
You didn't call the ambulance. You didn't get the pigs and, hey, can y'all come save Roberts? Huh? Never crossed your mind? Never said, hey, Robert probably got some family out there. Let me alert the authorities. Come on, bro. Pack her up. She's done. She's done.
After Robert was dead, Susan said she just left the pig pen, and then 3 days later, she went back into the pig pen with bags and collected the little bits of Robert that had
What
not
in the
been
Dexter
eaten by
Morgan
the
is
pigs.
this, bro?
And then she took those bags of remains and chucked them into her barn on top of the trash pile. But clearly, Robert's remains had not remained in the barn because the thing that deputy had whispered into the sheriff's ear when the sheriff was talking to Susan in the kitchen was, "Sir, we found a leg outside." It was Robert's leg, and it was found not inside of the barn in the trash pile, but out in the middle of her property, just out in the open. Susan, when confronted with that information, suggested that, maybe a wild animal had gone into the barn, got a hold of it, and dragged it off. The sheriff didn't even know what follow-up questions to ask. And so he just said, well, why didn't you call 911 when you first saw Robert? I mean, maybe you could have saved him. Or at least after he was dead, why didn't you tell someone? Susan would say that the reason she didn't tell anyone is she was afraid that if word got out about what her pigs had done, then her pigs would be euthanized and she would lose a major revenue stream because she sold her pigs' meat in town. And she said even if her pigs were not euthanized, she was worried people in town would not want to buy her pigs' meat after they learned her pigs were attacking and...
Hey, y'all want to hear something even crazier than that? Listen, food industry, y'all gonna have to do what y'all do. You know what I'm saying? But you know how they say they use cow manure to grow? You know what I'm saying? They use cow dookie to grow plants. You know what we eat? Hey, listen, they be using human dookie, okay? Listen, your plants, your fruits, your vegetables, they are grown with human dookie, okay? I'm sorry to tell you, today's the day. Don't believe me, look it up. You know what I'm saying? If the the FDA show up at my door, y'all better have a check, all right? Because look, the videos here, they gonna know it was y'all. So be careful, all right? You know what I'm saying?
Eating humans.
Hey, y'all, the check big enough, I will never say this again, okay? I promise.
Susan would tell the sheriff exactly where they could find the bags that contained Robert's remains, and she even said she would take a polygraph test to show she was now telling the whole truth. But when
Bro, what's the options? Y'all want me to eat freaking... What do y'all want me to eat? All right? If I don't eat the fruits and vegetables, what else am I supposed to eat? Hey, man, gotta do what you gotta do out here, bro.
She actually sat down to take the polygraph test, she kept fidgeting and coughing and doing these really dramatic sighs, and it was causing the test operator to get really inaccurate readings. And so when this first polygraph test was over, the results were inconclusive. And so the investigators made Susan take another test, but again,
Susan trying to slide out, boy, for real.
And so finally, the investigators in the room watching this happen just called off the test. And when they did, they said to Susan, hey, we're going to search your farm, and if there is anything on your farm that you have not told us about, you're going to be in serious trouble because we're going to find it. At this point, Susan kind of stopped fidgeting, and she looked up at the investigators, and after a long pause, she reached out across the table and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. She pulled it back, and she began drawing something. And after a few seconds, it became pretty clear she was drawing a map of her farm. And after the map was all drawn out, she drew a big X in the middle of it, and then slid the map back across the table to the investigators, and she said, if you go to that X, you'll find Stephen. And the investigators are like,
Stephen?
Who's Stephen? We're talking about Robert. What are you talking about? Well, it would turn out Robert was not the only farmhand to die on Susan's property. In 2012, about a year before Susan hired Robert, she hired another man named Stephen Delicino. And according to Susan, Stephen was a lot like Robert. He was really easy to get along with, he was quiet, he worked hard. But at some point, Susan said they had a big falling out. Susan said she started to...
They had a falling out because they didn't want to beat the Doonies, bro. That's what it is. That's what it is. All right? Come on now. Wait, listen.
To suspect that Stephen was stealing her guns in her barn, and so she went to confront him. And during this confrontation, they got into this big fight, and Susan said she didn't really remember all the details of what happened next, but at some point during this fight, a gun went off, and then Stephen fell to the ground in the middle of the pig pen with his head bleeding, and all of Susan's pigs suddenly swarmed him and began eating him. The stunned investigators again asked Susan, okay, if that really happened the way you said it did, why didn't you call 911 if this was like an accident?
Exactly.
And Susan would say, again, that her big fear was her pigs would either be
1967?
euthanized or word would get out that her pigs were eating people, and the people in town would not want to buy her pig's meat because of that. In the end, as far-fetched
This
as
is
Susan's
gross.
stories were about what happened to Robert Haney and Stephen Delacino, there was never any evidence that actually contradicted her claims. And so as a result, when Susan went on trial for murdering Robert and Stephen, it came down to whether or not the jury believed Susan. And they didn't. Not at all. They believed that Susan was completely lying, and that in reality, Susan,
Facts.
who was known to have a very quick temper, shot Stephen and shot Robert very much on purpose, and then threw them into her pig pen. We can only hope they were dead before her pigs began eating them.
Yeah.
On April 21st, 2015, more than a year after Robert's children
Somebody
had
else
reported
died?
him missing, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of murder for Robert and for Stephen,
That's tough.
and 2 counts of abusing a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, Susan would be over
Bro, 50 years! Listen, she killed 2 people, fed them to pigs, fed those pigs to the people of the town. You're done, Susan. Oh, man. I mean, 50 years. I don't know.
saying there were 17 other bodies buried on her property.
Yo, nah, she's finished. She's finished. Susan. What? Oh, my God. Yo, nah, she is really one of them, all right? Everybody talking about, hey, listen, Jamila Dahmer right here, okay? That's what we got on our hands. And she's 66.
However, when the police went out there and searched again very extensively, they never found any other remains. So that's going to do it. If you got something
17 other bodies?
out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a cup of coffee, but be sure.
Oh, yeah, if she's 66, she gets 60 years or 50 years, 110. You know what I'm saying? She's out of here.
It's full of coffee grounds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have
But then she cut her hair in jail. She like Kurt Angle. Now my man got to live with that. Yo, that's crazy.
a podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we put out the
All right, Dio Brando, you're done. You're getting banned, big fella.
remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. The podcast is called the Mr. Ballin Podcast.
Hey man, this was a crazy story. I ain't gonna lie. Susan is a menace to society. She must be dealt with, which she was. You know what I'm saying? They find them other 17 bodies. Who is it? What they say? This was like 2002? Something? That means she been in there for about 20 of them things. I don't even know if she's still alive. We need to tell all. Hey, the truth will set you free, Susan. Tell the truth. All right? We need to know what happened. So we can tell the real story about who you are, okay? Because Netflix is looking for some more stories to make, all right? The Monster series, they did Jeffrey Dahmer. They probably gonna do John Wayne Gacy. You up there too, okay? Don't try to escape. You one of them, okay? You're done.